There are very few words in the vocabulary of Catholic theology more important or more ancient than grace. Indeed, all sorts of very careful and very important distinctions about the meaning of the word grace have been drawn by theologians over the course of centuries. But I suspect that there are few things I could do today more helpful than to give a straightforward, but I think all-encompassing definition of the word. When I'm using the word grace, I mean the love of God outside the Trinity. From all eternity, God is pure and perfect self-gift, and our doctrine of the Trinity is one way of exploring the meaning of that statement. When God chooses to give God's self away outside the Trinity, we're talking about grace. And what happens when God does give God's self away outside the Trinity? What happens is the universe. The universe exists because God loves it completely, perfectly, absolutely, at every moment. You and I exist because we are held in being by God. We are loved into existence. And that love of God, which lies at the root of all creation, including you and me, that love is called grace. The whole of creation exists because it is engraced. That means that one cannot gain grace or lose grace. If one lost grace, if one ceased to be loved by God, one would not be damned, one would simply not be. Because the very foundation of being is grace, the pure and perfect love of God. And so, all creation exists because it is held in being by the action of God, who is always self-gift. Now that is a very important point to keep in mind, because it is going to found not only our doctrine of creation, everything that exists exists because it's held in being by God's grace. It will also, very importantly, be the underpinning of everything that we say in the Catholic tradition about sacraments. If everything is loved by God, if everything is engraced, then somewhere, sometime, that grace must be expressed. If I can give an example. If God is everywhere, and we certainly maintain that God is, then how can there be certain sacred places? For example, we call a church or a chapel sacred space. But certainly that can't mean that God is present there, but not present in the parking lot next door, or the supermarket, or the bank. If God is present everywhere, what makes the church or chapel special, a sacred place? And the answer is, not that God is present there and absent elsewhere, but that because God is present everywhere, you and I need to observe, to attend to celebrate that presence somewhere. And so the community decides to set apart this particular place and call it sacred. We call Sunday the day of the Lord. Now, does that mean that God is away on Tuesdays or plays golf on Thursdays? The point is that every day is God's day. But if all time is God's time, sometime we'd better notice the fact. And therefore, the community has traditionally set aside that first day of the week, Sunday, as the Lord's Day. And so we call it sacred time. But the reason there is a sacred time or a sacred place is really because all times and all places are God's. It isn't God who needs that sacred space and time. It's we who need particular times and places to attend to the ever-present grace of God. This is the heart of what might be called the sacramental principle. And the sacramental principle is the heart of the Catholic understanding of the Christian tradition. The sacramental principle might well be summed up as, if something is always and everywhere the case, it must be attended to somewhere, sometime. What is always true must be noticed as true at a particular time and a particular place. So we look at the whole of creation, all of which is grounded in grace, and those moments, those persons, places, things, events, actions, which help us to notice the presence of grace, are the points at which we speak of sacraments. What can be sacramental? Anything. How many sacraments are there? How many things are in existence in the universe? There are, of course, the 7 great communal sacraments, those 7 great moments in the Church's life which the community has set apart as particular celebrations of God's grace in the world and in our lives. But all of us have personal sacraments, people or places or events which speak to us deeply and richly of the love of God which we know surrounds us always, but of which we are not always aware. And those particular persons and places and events are sacraments for us. And sometimes those personal sacraments may be even more effective as signs of grace than the great public sacraments. We've all had the experience of attending a Mass and finding that, for whatever reason, perhaps we were too tired or just out of sorts at the moment, that we didn't really get as much out of the celebration as we might have. And later that same day, we've had the opportunity for a little quiet time, a moment to take a walk in a place that we really like, an opportunity to stop and recollect our thoughts. And those moments of quiet prayer have been, in fact, more effective signs of grace for us on that particular day than the celebration of Mass was. The moment when we prayed privately, that personal sacramental moment, proved more fruitful, more effectively a sign of grace for us that day than did the public celebration of the Eucharist at Mass. The whole of the Catholic tradition could in some ways be described as a training in becoming sacramental beholders. The great 19th century English poet, who also happened to be a Jesuit priest, Gerard Manley Hopkins, writes in one of his poems that is most often quoted, Harangue and Harvest, of walking home one day to the Jesuit residence he lived at in Wales. He speaks of the fact that he was concerned about the passage of summer and the coming of winter, that he was going to miss the beauty of the season that was departing and not looking forward to a long, cold winter at Wales. When he began to realize that he was lamenting what was past and fearing what was to come without paying attention to the moment he found himself in. And at that moment, he was able to observe the beauty that existed all around him. And he concludes the poem with the wonderful line, these things were here, and but the beholder wanting." I think that's the most beautiful expression in English that I know of the sacramental principle. The grace of God is there, always there. What's missing is someone to behold it. And the moments at which we become beholders are sacramental moments. All of us are learning to be beholders of grace. That grace is to be found everywhere. Now that's a very important distinction. If this is true, of course, what I'm saying to you about grace and the sacramental principle, then you realize that we can't make an easy distinction between the sacred in life and the secular. We can't divide our world up into the realm of grace and the realm of ordinary or natural life. The whole of life is engraced. There isn't any realm of the sacred, a point in our experience, a moment in time, a place in our world, which can be set apart as the domain of God, as opposed to all of the rest of our life, all the rest of our world, which would merely be ordinary life. All of life rests on grace. And that means that we cannot divide up the world into our actions and God's actions. No one in the Christian tradition has said this more forcefully and more carefully than St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas insists again and again throughout his writings that one cannot divide up any event into God's work and our work. Indeed, says St. Thomas, one of the great mistakes that people make when thinking about an event is to ask how much of this was caused by God and how much of it can be explained by purely natural causes. As if, says St. Thomas, one could say that God did part of the work and we did part of the work, or that nature did part of the work. Quite the contrary, St. Thomas insists. One has to say that everything that happens is caused 100% by God and 100% by natural agents. Because you see, God is God. What St. Thomas is presupposing is that we recognize that God is never in competition with God's creatures. God, after all, is sovereignly God. There isn't any competition to or with God. And consequently, God does not act alongside natural causes. God is what undergirds all natural causes. In some ways, I suppose, I could make a comparison with my hand. There's only one hand here. One can look at it from the front or look at it from the back, but there aren't a front and a back here. There's just one reality, one hand. The same thing is true about the world. There isn't a universe of grace and a universe that is merely natural. There's only one universe. You can look at the whole of the universe from one perspective and call it grace. You could look at it from another perspective and call it nature. But there aren't two realms, that of grace and nature. There's only the one universe that God calls into being. So the difference between grace and nature is not a difference between two separate domains or two separate levels of reality. The difference between nature and grace is a difference of perspective. It's a matter of how one looks at the world. It's what St. Thomas Aquinas and many scholastic theologians called a modal difference. The world under one mode is called grace. The world under another mode is called nature. But the whole of it is caused by God, and the whole of it is caused by natural causes. It's all natural, but it's also all grace. What changes is how one beholds the world. This means that we cannot divide our lives up into sacred actions and ordinary or natural actions. Every action can be a sacred action, and every action can be a natural action. It means that there is no domain of our life that is simply foreign to grace. We can't say that what we do when we celebrate the Eucharist is holy, but what we do when we enter a voting booth, or go into a supermarket, or what we do at our work, or how we act in our schools, or what we do in our homes, or how we act in the public marketplace, that those domains, those aspects of life are remote from grace, a natural part of our lives, as opposed to those supernatural islands, those special moments that are the domain of grace. What happens on Sunday cannot be isolated from what happens on Monday through Saturday. We don't live in two realms. We live in one realm which can be regarded from two perspectives. The English poet William Blake in the 18th century wrote, "Twofold ever may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." That is to say, may we never fall into the mistake of looking at the world from one vision perspectives, out of one eye, as it were, simply seeing the world as a play of natural forces. That, he thought, was the mistake of the sciences. That was Newton's sleep. We have to recognize that the world can be looked at from two perspectives, and the other eye has to be kept open as well, that the world is both totally God's and totally natural, that the world is held in being at every moment by God's action. And we have to understand that in looking at our lives. We cannot parcel out our lives into the natural and the supernatural. All of life is supernaturally grounded. All of life is built on grace. The church is not a community which seeks to lead people to move from one level to another. The church is the community that witnesses to the graced reality of the whole world. So the church is not an isolated community of grace in a profane or secular world. The church is the point at which we come to see what is true of the whole world. The church is not the community of those who are loved by God in a world which is not loved by God, a world of grace in an ungraced world. Since the whole world is graced, the church is a sacrament, a pointer, a moment at which the reality of the whole world comes to the surface and can be clearly seen, or at least should be clearly seen. That means that the church's mission is not to go out and say to the world, "Come and be what we are, and then you will be engraced." Rather, the church's mission is to say, "You are already engraced. Aren't you delighted? Well, come and celebrate it with the rest of us." The church is the sacrament of the meaning of the world. The sacred is the sacramental form of the secular. Grace is what underlies all of nature. You and I can accept grace more fully. You and I can reject grace. But what we cannot do is fall out of grace, because grace is the love of God outside the Trinity. We may accept that love or reject that love, but we can do nothing that will prevent God from loving us. The love of God is always present. Grace is everywhere.